C++ 2020, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Amanda Elam. Amanda, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me, David. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work we're doing at Babson College on women's entrepreneurship and diversity and inclusion. My name is Amanda Elam. I'm the CEO of a medical diagnostics early stage company in North Carolina called Galaxy Diagnostics, where we do clinical testing for flea and tick-borne diseases that are in the early discovery phase. I'm also a Diana Research Fellow at Babson College at the Diana International Research Institute, where I'm conducting research on gender and entrepreneurship primarily.
So tell us a little bit more about the Diana Research Project. I think it's one of the longest standing initiatives looking at the data in the space around women's participation in the startup ecosystem.
Yeah, so it's actually a really exciting project. We've been around since 1999. It's an international research consortium, the Diana Project. It was, sorry about that. It was founded by 5 management scholars. So Candida Brush, Patricia Green, Nancy Carter, Myra Hart, and Betsy Gatewood. They were all interested in the topic of new business startup and growth, and particularly interested in the experiences of women founders, access to resources, that sort of thing. And so through a biannual conferences over the last 2 decades, the Diana Project has successfully brought hundreds of scholars together from around the world to share and disseminate knowledge about this understudied topic, right? The challenges and opportunities for high potential women entrepreneurs. As of January of this year, 2020, the Diana Project now has a permanent home at Babson College. So that's what the Diana International Research Institute is. We've created a permanent home, and we're actually expanding the membership. We want to expand the conversation beyond entrepreneurship researchers to include educators inside and outside of the academy, entrepreneurs, bankers, investors, other key stakeholders who are really interested in the topic of women's entrepreneurship.
So talk a little bit about the evolution of data collection over the 21 years that you've been in operation. One of the themes around inclusion I've heard from a number of the speakers at the conference is that to really have an informed and actionable conversation, you have to be able to understand the current state and measure it. So what are the ways that you measure it, and what are the lessons you've learned over time in doing that measurement?
I think that's a really important question. How has it changed over time? You know, women have been business owners from the beginning of time. There are even biblical references to women business owners. What has changed, though, is we only really started measuring business ownership, you know, in the 1800s, really, and we did that through business registrations. These are formal registrations. So which businesses ever register formally?
Right.
And so most of the businesses that women start, women founders start, you know, 99.9% of them are sole proprietorships. We know that from the registered data in the US now. How many of them are informal? And we know in other countries around the world that women are involved very heavily in the informal sectors in many economies. And you'll appreciate, David, the fact that in developing contexts, especially, you know, the economies itself are really are small businesses. There just aren't a lot of really large firms. Our economy, in contrast, is really characterized by some very big firms. So in these economies, most of the entrepreneurship is informal for women and for men. So business registration data is the primary data sources we use to study these topics historically, and they're very limited. So what's really changed over time, for example, with the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor program, is we've come up with better ways to measure entrepreneurship. So by defining that, I'm going to define that as you know, new businesses, starting new businesses, venture creation, and we measure intentions, entrepreneurial intentions, people who are thinking about starting a business or have plans to. We measure People are actually starting businesses, like participating in activities that will lead to business start. People are actually, their businesses are earning money. And then, after a number of years, they become established businesses. So we're also doing nationally represented samples. This has been a very powerful data set for really understanding entrepreneurship as it's conceived as new business startup. But we also study self-employment data. So the labor force data that we collect, certainly in the US, every country has this, where we're asking people if they're self-employed. That's another definition of entrepreneurship. And then finally, you probably are aware that entrepreneurship's also that innovation activities in small firms and even sometimes in very large firms is referred to as entrepreneurship. And those are different. So the patent data, for example, is really popular. Studying gender is not something we've been doing for a long time in management. We really started in the 80s, actually late 80s is when some of the first real studies came out. And that's where we were really shifting from self-employment to focusing on new business creation. And with the distinction between, again, sole proprietorships and employer firms, informal businesses and registered businesses. And the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Project actually came out around the same time that the Diana Project was established. So the first year of data was 1999 as well.
Right. So what can investor firms and governmental agencies and NGOs and startup founding teams do to collect data and measure the right things? And how can they do that in a way that if we're trying to make the ecosystem more transparent and understandable so that we can draw conclusions from the data, what can those leaders do to make data collection better?
So I think the first question to that is, especially if we're looking at banking and we're looking in equity investment markets, I think the answer is just collect data on gender. A lot of what we don't know there is because nobody's really tracking the gender of the founders, right? And you appreciate too that that's very different in the firms where they never go after any kind of external financing versus the firms who do go after banking versus the firms that go after equity.
Sure.
On the equity side of things, most of those founders are founding teams. So we're interested in gender representation on those teams. And that's actually one area where we've seen, the advance of women in entrepreneurship pretty significantly in the United States. Right, we have a 3 to 4 time increase in females on VC funded company, the founding teams, like since the early 2000s, and that's significant. It shows that there are more women participating in those.
What are the numbers in the U.S.? I think I've seen something that like 82% of founding teams are all male. I don't know what data are most recent.
Yeah, it's about that. It's still about 80%. And then for women founders, where you have like a majority ownership, there you're talking about, 2% of VC firms.
Sure. And how does that compare to the rest of the world? I mean, one of the interesting questions is US is about 50% of venture fund investment, but the rest of the world is the other 50%. And it's a much more diverse population. How does the U.S. compare? What markets do you see as leading in this? What markets do you see as moving the fastest in the direction towards inclusion?
Okay, that is a great question. And the only international comparative data I know in that point actually is a fairly relaxed measure that we have in the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor data. So the GEM data suggests that men around the world who are surveyed are about 5.5% of them have invested in another firm, and that it's about a 1 to 1.5% lower rate for women. So in other words, women are super active, like 3/4 of them are actually, compared to men, are actually investing. Where like 1 out of 3 investors are women around the world. I have never seen any VC equity data comparative globally that
Yeah.
really answers that question. So you've just now highlighted a place where we could really benefit from doing that. My expectation, based on experience with different data sets, would be that the rates in the US and Europe in terms of share or proportion is probably pretty similar among the developed nations.
Right.
But that in developing contexts, it's probably really mostly men. And in transitional economies, so in between the highly developed and the most earliest stage economies, I think you're probably looking at a mix with a lot of variability. So there are certain countries like Thailand, for example, where women are more active in entrepreneurship than men. And those women, they may not be going after equity funding per se, but they're funding other businesses at really high rates,
Yeah.
as the same rate as men or higher. Whereas we're seeing more disparity in investor activity in some of these developed countries, and it can vary a lot by culture, and participation rate.
Can you speak specifically to China and India? Those are massive venture markets with huge populations. What
Yeah.
kinds of observations are you seeing in those markets?
I would say in Asia and India, we see incredibly dynamic entrepreneurship activity rates going on. We again limited data coming out of China, but women are very active in both economies. Women are very active at starting and growing businesses. In part, China, it goes back to the revolution and equity. There was a lot of parity there in terms of men and women in work, and so a lot of those gender norms have been broken down. And I think we find very similar things in India. I expect we're going to find the same trends there in China and in India that we see in other economies, though, where women are more likely to have sole proprietorships, more likely to be involved in the informal sector, and the question then would be, to what extent are they experiencing some of the same challenges when they go after high potential, high growth employer firms?
So what kinds of conclusions do you draw from that data? If you look at the arc over the last 20 years, what are the biggest changes that we've seen in the treatment of women in the ecosystem? And what are the things that, in your view, have been the most effective levers of driving change?
Yeah, so some of the things I'm the most excited about, like just in my short career, right? So in the last 20 years, the actual participation rates as we measure them in GEM haven't changed very much. But when we go to the registered business data, we do see some important trends. We see that women in the US have been starting businesses at very high rates, and their closure rates are lower than men. And we also see especially that minority women in the United States now have a majority share of the majority women-owned businesses. What I'll caution you on there, and everybody else listening, is that in the registration data, the way it's reported for majority women-owned means that women own 51% or more of the business. Or, a woman owns 51% or more of the business, and then the majority men-owned, or men own 51% or more of the business. And then there's this category of jointly owned, where it doesn't, this jointly owned category, doesn't receive enough attention. Let's just say, it's like 2.5 million businesses, and we don't pay a lot of attention to it.
So one of the dynamics, at least in the data I've seen, is that while there's a massive number of women and minority-led business starts, if you look at the allocation of capital across the starts, a very small proportion goes to these businesses. Do you look at the relative allocation of capital, and what things do you see there if you are looking at that?
So before I answer that question, I'm going to go back to the things I'm excited about.
Okay,
The one trend I hadn't finished describing that I think is really important is that, so we have two other trends, right? So we see the three trends are, one is we have the increased participation of females on VC-funded founding teams.
Right.
The second trend that I think is really important is we've seen a six-fold increase in media mentions. So the celebration of female entrepreneurs and especially unicorns, in the top performers in the U.S. This has really changed over 20 years. So getting so much more media attention. The third thing is we're seeing a threefold increase in women's entrepreneurship research, especially in the developing world. So there's been this huge burgeoning interest in really unpacking and understanding women's entrepreneurship. And I think it's really important because if 1 out of 3 business owners in the world is female, but they are taken out of the equation when it comes to research or media focus or any of these things, that's a problem. And that seems to be
Absolutely.
solved,
Yeah.
right? We're making great progress on that. I'm very excited about that. Now, when it comes to looking at allocations of capital, there's a challenge there, right? We are definitely encountering a problem or challenges, barriers for women entrepreneurs, women founders. Now, when we're unpacking that question, though, we have to be really sober about it, right? Is it, the common construction of the problem set is, well, is it gender bias, gender discrimination, or is it pipeline problem? Like, are women not seeking equity? And there's evidence to support both arguments. And so when I'm looking at unpacking that, one of the things I want people to know is that most of the equity investments in the United States go to ICT, right? So it's internet, computers, technology, software companies largely suck out all the air out of the capital that's available in the venture space. Why? Because the margins are high, because the ROI is high, and most of that investing is all about making money. Women tend to start businesses in industries where there isn't a lot of VC capital investment. That's changing because we now have this growing wave of impact investing. And women are much more likely to start businesses in sectors like education, healthcare, and even some consumer products, especially I think about emerging sectors like, vegetarian, vegan industries. Women are, and also in clean tech and solar spaces where it's about environmental protection, women are very active there. And so that's where impact investing is going. So traditional VC model doesn't work super well for women. We know that there's increasing interest. We're seeing this at Deary, an increasing interest from male investors saying, what am I missing here? Because increasingly when they go out to look at what's in their deal flow, they're finding that companies that they see out on their travels did approach their venture firm, but never got pushed up the queue. Yeah. What's happening there? And often it's things like, well, it was femtech. Right. It's a female market. What do we know about female markets? Most of the people who work at our VC firm are male. They don't know, they can't appreciate why, this technology might be important. Who's it going to appeal to? The same way that, by the way, that female VC investors might not appreciate certain markets where men would be super gung-ho about the product or service opportunity, right?
Sure.
And so
I mean, just on that, I talked to a founder recently with a set of medical solutions for menopause, and just her experiences about when you're talking to an all-male investment committee, it can be pretty painful.
Yep.
So just being, and I think that when you look at the distribution of consumer markets, there's a preponderance of solutions for problems for rich white people, because those are the things that it's easiest for traditional venture firms to understand. So there's an arbitrage or new market opportunity.
Right. So we have sort of the occupational industry segregation, right? So women aren't represented in the best funded industries. We have the whole market issue. Women are starting companies that are often targeting very female markets, and they're not well understood by investors. And then we kind of come down to this question of gender bias. So in the moment, at the point of pitch, at the point of decision, is there evidence that women aren't being treated as seriously, or that they're being treated skeptically, might be a way
Yeah,
of putting it.
I've seen some studies at least that talk about the different conversational paths based on observation that male founders are asked more about upside and female founders are asked more about downside. Uh,
Yep.
and so, I think there's an opportunity for investors to recognize that that systemic bias exists in the culture and that they
Yep.
can mitigate it by being intentional about it.
Yeah, and David, honestly, as a CEO and someone who's gone through a number of these events, been the experience, I have to honestly say, now I'm on the more highly educated, more possibly more articulate, but I feel my feminine biases, right? Like I'm really, I'm less quick to use numbers than some of the guys on
Uh-huh.
stage with me. I'm more likely to talk about the social impact and the benefit. So I think that it goes even beyond some of the, like, you want to throw a downside question at me, I can spin it and I can talk about big, but I'm also less inclined, more reluctant to tell the big fish story.
Right.
I'm just not as comfortable as some people
Right.
are at exaggerating. So if I do a bottom up analysis that says, I think that in 5 years, this business could be a $10 million business. And I mean that very soberly. I'm highly confident
Sure.
I can get it to 10 million in 5 years. I can tell you right now that a number of my male comrades, especially the ones who've been doing this for a while, there's no way they would pitch that. They would go out and they'd say, no, I'm going to be a $50 million, I'm going to be $100 million
Absolutely.
company in 5 years. And there's
Right.
no common sense to that. There's
And,
no ground to that. But
and
it's the
every
game, right? That's
founder's
part of the flashy, interesting story. VCs almost expect it sometimes.
absolutely
And if you aren't telling it, you're not confident
every
enough.
founder's their model's conservative no matter what the numbers are, right? It's
Yeah,
like this is really conservative, but
yeah.
yeah.
So
Um,
does the game need to change, or do the people who pitch need to play the game? I mean, that's fundamentally one of the challenges I think a lot of female founders experience coming at this. It's like, why
and
would you want to invest in a lie? Why
right,
don't you want to invest in
right.
mine? I've got the data.
And in your experience as a founder and CEO, as well as a researcher, um, do you feel qualitative differences when you're in a room pitching to a mixed audience with women MDs? How does that change the dynamic?
I think it's really nice to have a woman in a room as a friend, as a friendly face
Yeah,
for me.
yeah,
But I don't really need it. What I need is a friendly face. So sometimes I just need even, a male who I've known before I walk in the room can be the friendly face. So I think focusing too much on gender can be a little limited. As a player in the game, I
sure.
think the focus on gender can be a little limited sometimes. Because I do see a lot of it as like, communication problem. I do see it as a lack of understanding. One of my favorite stories I like to tell, David, about my actual experience of
Right.
going through this is I was in an incubator. I started my company in an incubator in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina called the First Flight Venture Center. It's still there, a fantastic organization. When I was there, there was another company in the incubator with us. I was so excited about their technology. So excited. As a woman, as a
Yeah,
consumer, I was so excited. They had a pain-free mammography.
yeah,
The name of the company was Zumatech. They were spin out from Duke universities. They had an MD and an engineer, starting the company. And the company since then has kind of closed down operations. They were very successful at raising SBIR funding for what they were doing. They had a really hard time pitching it and
yeah,
raising money around it. Why is a little complicated. 3D mammography was coming out at the time, more sensitive. That got a lot of pushback because it was resulting in a lot of false positives, which if you're being screened for cancer, you don't want a false
yeah,
positive,
yeah.
right?
It's not a good
So
day.
these guys are out pitching their technology, and what they're pitching is it's more sensitive than 3D mammography, right? And so they're getting all this pushback from investors going, wait a minute, we already invested in something like that, and we're
Yeah,
getting in, the doctors aren't happy with it. And so we're sitting around on a Friday afternoon having a
right.
beer. This is what you do, right? In the
Yeah,
incubator. And just kind of shooting the breeze around this. And they're talking about some of the challenges they had. And I said, you guys are pitching this all wrong. your market opportunity isn't a more sensitive mammography. Your market opportunity is pain-free. And they're like, well, why does that matter? And I'm like, guys, next time you walk into a meeting, I want you to start with, imagine if the only way to screen for testicular cancer, right, is to put the body parts between two metal plates and shrink it to 1/2 inch. What if there was a free pain-free version? Would you invest? And of course, we're all laughing and falling out of our chairs. We thought it was really funny. But that was the point, was that even the founders with this fantastic technology for the market, hadn't thought about the framing and hadn't thought about, what, and I can tell you, I would change doctors for pain-free. I would pay out of pocket for pain-free. My doctor would probably upgrade their equipment sooner rather than later if they thought they were losing patients to pain-free.
Right.
And that's what's lost, right? So what are investors missing? What great market opportunities are they missing?
So let me ask you, coming back to the research part of this, what are the most important short-term open questions that you hope the research community will answer, looking ahead the next 1, 2, 3 years? What are you most excited about there?
On the research side of things, I'm really excited. And in fact, I'm doing this and I'm going to drive this, but I think that we need to get beyond some of the conclusions that are drawn from the aggregate data. Like, I'm happy to see people doing more gender segregated analysis.
Right.
But for example, if you look at the business performance data, it suggests that women-owned firms don't perform as well as men-owned firms. Well, guess what? If you're comparing apples to oranges, if you have high levels of occupational industry segregation, so you're comparing how software companies perform to a healthcare startup or an education startup, that's dumb, right? It's like, of course, these are industry segments, consumer products, where companies tend to start small and they stay quite small. The margins are low, the competition's high. And so I'm really excited about some of the apples to apples comparison, because what we find in the data is, we find that when you compare women founders of companies that are similar to men founders of similar companies, there's very little difference. The experience is the experience. The job is the job. You just got to go after it. Where we see the difference is really is really when it comes to access to equity financing in developed countries. Now, in developing contexts, we've got a different problem set there, right? And there you've got very traditional gender cultures. The barriers that entrepreneurs have to overcome in order to start and grow a business could be the power dynamics in the household. Their husbands simply don't understand that there's a benefit to their wife being a successful business owner, right? Increases family income. The community leaders don't take the women seriously and are threatened by the advance of women in industry. So we've got a different problem set there, that one we've already fought in the United States and other developed economies. And so that's where education comes in. And this is something, so apples to apples in the research side, we're doing research around entrepreneurship education that shows that, the way I talk about this with my students is, the male students tend to be very bold. The women students tend to be very smart. So women are very careful with the risk calculations. They're usually point on. They perform on average a little higher than men on a lot of performance metrics, because the men are succeeding amazingly or failing tremendously. And successful entrepreneurs are bold and smart. And so our educational programming is focusing on, how do you move those women, towards the bold, and how do you move the men towards the, and of course, traditionally, business education's always been about the smarter, not about the bolder. So what we're seeing in terms of entrepreneurship education, especially in incubators, accelerators, so a lot of the non-academic programs, is that when we focus on like personal initiative, like personal empowerment, when we really look at talking to these entrepreneurs in a very personal way, coaching and mentoring, how can you take what you have and be a success? That is tremendously powerful for women to be able to talk about what their challenges are at home or in the workplace and find ways to get creative. And it just inspires them and motivates them. It increases program retention, and it increases profits over at least initially the next 2 years. So yeah, so advances in entrepreneurship education that go beyond the simple, this is what you need to know.
I love that. I think that's so on point. And part of that, from my perspective, is as we get more sophisticated at education, you can really do the individual gap assessments and say, hey, you need to be more assertive, you need to be more informed, you can really personalize the curriculum. Any last words for how can people that want to get involved with research initiatives that you're doing or that Babson's doing, or just to advance the category broadly, what are the things they can do to plug into that?
Well, I think if people are interested in learning more, they can come visit the GRE webpage and learn more about we do webinars for education. I think we had a little blip there.
We did.
We have entrepreneurship roundtables where we get
Yep.
educators around to look at specific models. We have researcher roundtables where we are looking at some of the latest advances. So I'd encourage them to come to the Diana International Research Institute, check out what we're doing. And if they're interested in sponsoring research, we do sponsored research studies. If they're interested in just learning about it, I'm happy to respond to emails to help educate.
Amanda, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Take care.